Prior to his current role, Williams worked for the Washington Post as a celebrated national political correspondent, a White House correspondent, and editorial writer. He has written for the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the New Yorker, the Atlantic, and Ebony. Moderating today's conversation is William Tarter, Jr., president of the NAACP Cleveland branch. Will also serves as the Director of Advocacy at the Lutheran Metropolitan Ministries and previously served as the Fellow of Public Policy at the Center for Community Solutions. If you have a question for Mr. Williams, you can text it to 330-541-5794, and the City Club staff will try to work it into the Q&A portion of the program. Now, members and friends of the City Club of Cleveland, please join me in welcoming Juan Williams and Will Tarter.
Thank you so much, Robin, and thank you to the City Club for hosting this conversation, and thank you, Juan, for joining us this morning. I want to open our conversation by grounding us in this moment and borrow from a friend of mine, Evelyn Burnett, who is in charge of Third Space Action Lab. She opens her conversations with what's called a soul check. And as two black men in America in 2025, I'd like to open our conversation today with a series of soul check questions just to ground us in this work. So the first question is, if you were describing your soul today as a song, artist, or piece of art, what would it be and why? That's the first question. The second is, who do you dedicate this conversation to? And the third question is, what's the best advice that sustains you in this work? So I'll leave those questions to you to open our conversation. So if you were describing your soul today as a song, artist, or piece of art, what would it be and why?
Well, I think it would be, remember, I'm old school. I see so many young people in the audience, they're going to think, what's he up to? But I'm just a 70-year-old guy. And your 70-year-old guy goes back in his mind to Curtis Mayfield and People Get Ready. Goes back to, Marvin Gaye, What's Going On. Goes back to Bob Dylan, and a change is going to come. So for me, that, if that's my soul check, that's the playlist of my mind.
I appreciate that. Thank you. And who do you dedicate this conversation to?
Well, it really goes to all the people in the audience, both here and listening. I really think that for any writer, this is about conversation. Another word for love, another four-letter word for love is talk. And I want to talk to people. I want people to know that I hear them and they can hear me, and that we can move forward, that our conversation goes somewhere.
And then what's the best advice that sustains you in this work?
So I think you're talking about my work as a writer, as an author. And I remember once talking with Alex Haley, who wrote Roots. And Alex, remember, he was older, obviously, now deceased. And Alex said to me, as a younger person, he said, find the good and praise it. And stayed with me, because we live in a world in which people are so fixed on the negative, or the outrageous, or the provocateurs in the world. But in fact, to find the good and things that would in fact inspire us, things that are worthy of emulation, seems to me to be the greater good.
Thank you for allowing us to ground us in that moment. It feels like we're in a very heavy time, and I wanted to make sure that we ground us in this space before we enter into the book. So as was mentioned earlier, you wrote Eyes on the Prize back in 1987. And I want to ask you as an opening question, why did you write this book, The New Prize for These Eyes?
So as I was saying to you, I am 70 years old. This is my 10th book. And there's, in a way, as you heard, you could describe it as a bookend to having written Eyes on the Prize nearly 40 years ago. But it's more than that. This is an important book. It has an important message that says to people, you have to open your eyes and not just be worshipful, nostalgic about the civil rights movement of the mid-20th century. You have to realize we're in the midst of a civil rights movement today. And so many people, I think, are slow to come to this recognition. In some ways, they're looking back to Dr. King and all the stories that were told. You were mentioning earlier that you sat with your parents and watched the first Eyes on the Prize videos when you were, I think you said, going off to college, a senior in high school. So it's easy to have that as a point of reference. It's harder for people to see what's going on today. So let me just offer a quick point of analogy, if you will. In 1963, we had possibly the pinnacle moment of the first civil rights movement, Dr. King's March on Washington. I see so many smart-looking young people in here. I bet they even know that's where he gave the I Have a Dream speech. 250,000 people in Washington, D.C. Fast forward to this moment and think about what happened after George Floyd's death. We had marches, but there were thousands of marches all over the United States. Marches all over the globe. You could have been in Paris, you could have been in London, you could have been in Buenos Aires. There were marches under the Black Lives Matter banner. And even as we sit here today, this is a movement that's going on 24/7. The first movement, if you think back to it, they had to rely on so-called gatekeepers and the big newspapers or the big networks to get the message out that something was happening, they had an agenda. Today, tweets, viral messages, viral images, memes, it just goes on and on as a constant conversation about race. And I say that on a day in which you can pick up the news and there is the president blaming an airplane crash on diversity, equity, and inclusion. That is a conversation about race that's taking place in America today. So I just want you to be aware, especially the young people who have come out, and I appreciate your presence so much, that you can't just look back and think, you know what, this movement is something that my parents took part in, and it's something that I should study and know the basics of. You have to see yourself as a history maker in today's movement.
So I want to expand on that. You called this the second civil rights movement. And I have to admit, that's one of the first times I've heard that phrase used. So why do you call it the second civil rights movement?
Well, it's the second movement because it's distinct from the first. So we think about the first, and I would say the agenda for the first, very clearly, was getting the Congress of the United States to pass civil rights laws. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 was the reason Dr. King was marching in '63. And then comes the 1965 Voting Rights Act. And again, the idea was that Congress would affirm that every American, every citizen, regardless of race, regardless of gender, has to have their rights protected in the United States. So that's the first civil rights movement. Now you fast forward, and here we are in a movement that really, I think, is based on the whole difficulty of the relationship between the police and young black people. We remember Trayvon Martin, who was killed by a volunteer security guard, but you can go fast forward through Eric Garner, through Michael Brown in Ferguson, Missouri, and of course George Floyd, maybe most famously of all. And you can see, hey, there's a pattern here, and people associate Black Lives Matter's agenda with those murders, but also with the whole problem that we have here in 2025, mass incarceration, right? We know 1 of every 3 young black men is going to have some interaction with police or end up in jail at one point in his life. And we have other issues. Income inequality still bedevils us in terms of race in this society. And I think you also have this broader issues that President Trump is raising every moment in his attacks on diversity, equity, and inclusion. What do we think about America in the 21st century when it comes to race and admissions to school. Should race be a factor? Here I'm talking really to the young people. Should race be a factor if I'm considering you for admission to college? What about hiring you after college? Should race be a consideration in hiring someone? Even if I'm saying that it's about diversity, is that legitimate, or is it reverse discrimination against whites? Also, think about, if you will, some of the broader arguments that go beyond simply admissions and hiring. Think about cultural representation, so-called identity politics. President Trump uses that as a slur. He says identity politics is wrong. He says Black Lives Matter is a symbol of hate. But what do you say if I say to you, identity politics is nothing new. We've had identity politics in America from the start. Remember, black people were only 2/3 of a full human when it came to the vote. I think that's identity politics.
Oh, sorry, 3/5.
Yeah.
Yes, right. And so I think that one of the things that you talk in the book is contrasting the first civil rights movement to the second civil rights movement. And you mentioned in the book, you talk about how the second civil rights movement focuses on justice, police reform, and continued voter protections. One of the hallmarks of the civil rights movement, the first civil rights movement, are the successes in terms of the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act. But as you talk about in your book, there's a lot of resistance to those very reforms in the second civil rights movement. So can you talk about some of the challenges in this moment to the second civil rights movement, and how individuals and collectively, how can we overcome those?
Well, I think it's important, Will, then to help you set the stage for the second civil rights movement from the way that I see it as a writer, trying to tell contemporary history. You know, the great thing about the first Eyes on the Prize is that people to this moment come up to me and said, I read that book when I was in school, or I'm reading that book. It has lasting value. And what I want for this book, you know, from the deepest part of me, my identity as a writer, is that this book would have value for all of you, not only in this moment where you would say, oh, I see something going on in my life because this is an account of contemporary history, but it would have value for your friends, for your relatives, and maybe for future generations in your family. And here I'm thinking of you. But let's start at the start. In 2004, so more than 20 years ago, just more than 20 years ago, Barack Obama spoke at the Democratic National Convention. And at that moment, he really opened a new door. He starts off giving a speech, and people in the audience were like talking and ignoring him. He was just a young rising politician from Illinois, state legislator. But as he's speaking, and I was in the room, it was a convention hall in Boston, the place got quiet. It was very intriguing because he started saying things like this. We're not a black America. We're not a white America. We're not a Latino America. We're not an Asian America. We're the United States of America. And then, you know, people are accustomed to the Jesse Jacksons of the world and pointing out the inequities that exist in the society along racial lines. Instead of that, they heard this young black man say, my story wouldn't have been possible in any other country but America. And I'm so glad to be in America and an American. This was a distinct message from the messages that had been coming from black leadership. And I think that for a lot of people it was, you know, eye-opening and sort of disarming, but also incredibly optimistic. It opened a new horizon in terms of what's possible in talking about race relations in America. Now, the real signature of that moment was so many people like me started writing, talking about, are we living in a post-racial America? Post-racial as in, a new era of race relations. And of course, you all know Obama goes on to win the presidency, the election in 2008. And if you'll recall, his campaign poster contained so much of that optimism. It was a sort of beatific looking, eyes to the sky image of Barack Obama, and underneath was written one word, 4 letters, H-O-P-E, hope. It was so inspiring. He was an inspiring figure in terms of American life and our discussions about race. But what happens is immediately, even as he gets into office as the first black president, Ebony magazine on its cover writing, "In my lifetime," for people like me, it was unbelievable. The president is black. There were people who immediately were critical as he dealt with the financial crisis. Why are you bailing out Wall Street but not Main Street? And certainly from a racial perspective, why are you helping out these rich white people and not black people, middle income and poor? And then came criticisms from people who said, wait a minute, you're talking about a legislative agenda that includes the Affordable Care Act, then called Obamacare. You're gonna take apart my insurance policy and put in place a new system that's gonna help the middle class, the working class, the poor, disproportionately people of color. Maybe you're the black president, even as Obama was saying he's the president of all the people. They're now saying, oh no, I can see it. You got an agenda and it's about helping black people. And then there were controversies involving things like when Trayvon Martin was killed, and Obama said, if I had a son, he would have looked like Trayvon. And there were people who said, what? Why are you making this a racial issue? That kid was walking around in a hoodie. He looked threatening to a lot of people. Why do you have to bring race into this? And suddenly his numbers started to fall. And when he intervened, said something about a Harvard professor who tried to get into his own home. He had gone on a trip, lost his keys, trying to get into his house. The neighbors called the police come. And Henry Louis Gates explains that he's trying to get into his own house, but he gets into a confrontation with the police. The police arrest him, and when this becomes news, Obama says, well, how stupid is that? You're arresting a guy trying to get into his own house. Wow. So Obama's numbers, his approval rating with whites, had been well above 50 before that. Afterwards, never comes close to 50 again. Again, he now is perceived in some quarters as the black president. So you have Tea Party opposition that starts, especially in response, backlash to the Affordable Care Act. But then it really accelerates with Donald Trump and the birther movement, if you recollect. You know, this guy doesn't even belong here. He's not a legitimate American. Attacks on the first black president. So Will, to come back to your point, what is the agenda for this second civil rights movement? The first movement's agenda was pretty clear in terms of getting legislation passed. I think now, when you think about us contending with race in this moment, we are dealing not with legislation. We're dealing with trying to make the lived experience of being a racial minority, being a woman, being a disabled person in America today real and satisfying and in keeping with the notion of justice for all. That people feel they have an opportunity, they're not being silenced, they're not being ignored. And this takes place, this agenda, more diffuse and therefore harder to grasp than saying pass this civil rights law. It is more diffuse, but it is very real. And I think that's the point that I want to drive home to you today. That it's very real if you say, in this incredibly diverse country, because remember, during the time of the first movement, America's almost 90% white and about 10% black, few Latinos. Today, America's about 60+% white, black people about 13% of the population. But the largest minority group in the country is Latino, and the fastest growing minority group in the country is Asian. The conversation that previously had been between blacks and whites is now a conversation among a lot of people of different racial, ethnic backgrounds, and oftentimes people who have come to this country as immigrants. And immigration is now a principal front in our political fights and culture wars. All of this, again, more diffuse, but it's important that you don't be fooled, that you keep your eyes on the prize and understand we are engaged in trying to determine how America, as a multiracial society, deals with racial issues going forward.
You know, it's so ironic that you mention those things about demographic change and political change and even generational change. Last time you were speaking at the City Club was 2007, which I'll note that in the opening of your book, President Obama has a quote in there from 2007 when he contrasts the previous generation and the work that needs to be done here. So you mentioned those things back then in 2007, and you mentioned some of those same things today. So I'm wondering, when you were here the last time and you talked about this moment of change that we're in, have you seen much change between then and now, and why or why not?
Well, the change is so constant. It's incredible. And as I was trying to give you a sense of the kind of changes that we've lived through, obviously, with a black president, right? So when I was here in 2007, we didn't have the idea in mind, oh, a black person could be president of the United States. And then you see changes, and some of these changes, you know, the last time I was here was talking about Enough, another book that I had written, and it was talking about the failures of black leadership. Well, so that book really was aimed at the failures of people who were activists at that time. I was asking questions like, well, why don't we have civil rights marches against drug dealers? Why don't we have civil rights marches against bad schools in poor black and Latino neighborhoods? Why don't we complain bitterly about the lack of job opportunities for people who are qualified, but who find that they get ignored or marginalized because they don't have the connections, the family in the business? You know, that's what I was saying. Okay, now, one of the realities of the change that we've seen since 2007, to me, is obviously Obama, but Obama represents something very large, which is black power. That when you think about the reason for the passage of the Civil Rights Act, the whole notion was, if black people can vote, we can get more black politicians, and they'll do a better job of protecting black rights. Well, lots of people said, well, that's true, and look at all the black mayors, the black people in Congress, blacks in the Senate, and that's at a high point right now, in fact, and even in the White House, we've had a black man in the White House. But you have people who say, you know what? I don't see that these black politicians necessarily have delivered. And by the way, a lot of the activists, the Black Lives Matter activists, again, this is so much change. They were like, well, I don't even want to talk to Obama. You know, I see him as a politician. He's looking out for himself. He's trying to win a second term. I don't see him delivering with an urgency on the promise of a black man in power doing something for black people. And then you have people who would say, obviously from the other side, he's just a black president. He's doing everything for it. But then you have conversations that go beyond that. And you have people who are trying to understand what we can do, let's say, about schools, about vouchers, charter schools. How can we improve the quality of those schools? These are changes. We have conversations and arguments about how you protest. Is Colin Kaepernick allowed to kneel in protest of police brutality, or is he not being patriotic? Remember that Trump and others said, he's not patriotic. Kick him out, fire him, don't let him play. This is all change. These changes come in so many ways, Will, that it's sometimes hard to stop. And that's why I think it's important for people to realize, again, we're in the midst of these discussions, these events. We can get locked into the politics of the moment, but I think that we have to understand it as a moment in history. My key point here is this. A lot of these activists who saw black politicians and said, you know, we're disappointed. We don't see that we are getting this tremendous change. Include a lot of young people, young men of color. Remember, 50% of Latino young men voted for Trump. 25% of young black men voted for Trump. And people will say to me, well, how do you make sense of that? And I say, look, they're looking at their lives and they're saying the schools in my neighborhood suck. They're terrible. They're saying, I see a lot of violence in my neighborhood. It's not safe. And they're saying, I don't see that the black politicians have taken care of this issue. They're saying, I see income inequality, drugs, all that. They're saying, I don't see that this issue has been dealt with. So the status quo is not to my liking, even if a black woman is running and asking for my vote as a black person. They're saying, you know what? I'll buy into the disruption, the chaos. I'll excuse the racism, but just bring me something different. Let's shake this up. And I think that's why you see so many young people of color making what to me was a wild-eyed, short-term decision.
Wow. Yeah. Well, let's see. There's so many questions I have. Oh, we're running out of time. But there's two things that, for me, really stood out in the book. One was the backlash. Dr. King talked about it in his book, Where Do We Go From Here? And that moments of social progress create an ever-present tendency towards backlash. And so I want to get your thoughts on the social progress that has been made from the second civil rights movement and some of the backlash that I think we're experiencing in real time to this very day.
Without a doubt, Will, I don't think there's any doubt we're experiencing backlash. So earlier I mentioned to all of you that one of the accelerants of the second civil rights movement is social media, that people can have conversations, connect over social media in a way that was impossible in the first movement. But it's not only accelerant for people who were activists under the Black Lives banner, it's also an accelerant for white supremacists. It's an accelerant for the KKK, it's an accelerant for the Proud Boys and the Oath Keepers, and appeals to young people, white people, to say, oh, we're being discriminated against, we're not being treated fairly, and you know, it ends up with some of these folks marching in Charlottesville, if you'll recall, talking about we will not be replaced, Jews will not replace us, blacks will not replace us, women will not. You think, what is going on? Here in the 21st century, you can have this kind of people marching and saying this kind of stuff? To me, this is part of understanding the moment that we're living in. This is the resistance. And when you think about this, you understand that divisiveness, dividing us as an American people, because we are such a polyglot, we are such a mixing bowl of races, is very easy. In fact, look outside of us and think about, I wonder why the Russians and the Chinese, when they get on social media in the midst of political campaigns, aim so much of their fire at racial groups, because they understand that's a good way to divide America and weaken Americans. And we're doing it to ourselves when we talk about backlash. You can see it all around us. I think there are politicians, and I'm just going to avoid names, but I think there are politicians who play on racial division for political gain. And when you think about the whole notion of, saying something like, I don't even know if she's black. She just became black in order to run. You think, wait, who's he talking to? He's talking to black people about Kamala Harris? And now he's going to tell black people she's not really black and that she had an immigrant father? Wait a minute, hold on. And you say, oh, that's a division among black people that he sees as an opportunity to weaken the voting base for Kamala Harris. But if you don't stop and look at it, you wouldn't say it's just another racial moment. You'd say, oh, well, it's just politics and another extreme statement. But it had some power. And again, you stop and think about the #1 ad of the past campaign You say, well, that was interesting. I saw it during the football game. They had a transgender immigrant person in jail, and they said that that person was being given surgery by the U.S. government, and that Harris was for they, them, but Trump is for you. You think, wow, this is pretty wild. It's not a big issue in my life. I don't know about your life, but wouldn't be a big issue, and wasn't it the same law when Trump was in office the first time? But guess what? That ad had real impact, and it said, she's for they, them, I'm with you. Division. Division on the basis there of sexual or gender identity, again, is part of this conversation about who we are as Americans in this moment. So don't just think it's purely racial. We are such a mix. And that's why I so value this moment at the Cleveland City Club, Will, and thank you for being here. It's because I feel like a man on fire and saying to people, wake up to what's happening. We're in the midst of a second civil rights movement.
And you talk about there's, as I said, so many questions, but and I'm sure there'll be one that we'll get about media, because social media, I think, is something you mentioned earlier, and that's something that I would love to get your thoughts on, because the social media landscape today is different from just a few years ago when it was used as an instrument to get out a lot of the information about what things we're talking about. So my final two questions are, one, talk about the social media landscape today and what we're kind of seeing, because so much is being discussed about algorithms and the control of social media. So I'd like to look for you to talk about that. And then the final thing I want you to talk about.
Well, hold on.
Yeah.
Remember, I'm old. I can only keep one thing
All
in my
right.
mind. You know, you're getting tough on me.
Yeah. All right. Then we got to move to audience Q&A. So
okay, but I think on social media,
yeah,
you know, to me, so much of the social media is really a cesspool. And I say that because it invites people, you talked about algorithms, it invites people into rabbit holes. In other words, oh, you're interested in this issue? Well, we have people who agree with you on this issue. And so you can find, in terms of your media, affirmation for pre-existing opinions. Oh, but what's the obverse of that? You won't hear anybody who disagrees with you. Right. And in fact, you can find people who are even in deeper agreement with you, with your upset, with your grievance, and you can just start going steadily down so that you are, I guess, in a cylinder, if you will, of opinion and ideas. Maybe even more tragically, you are isolated in terms of empathy, understanding, relationship to people who think differently from you do. And I'm saying that really with some power to young people. You know, so I'm a dad and I'm a granddad. And you know, I see the impact on my granddaughters, especially. I think the impact of social media on young women, it's toxic. With all this stuff about, well, you know, you're missing out, you're not as good looking, you're not as wealthy, rich. It has a real impact. If you have some doubt about what I'm saying, go online. Go check and see how people who are social scientists talk about the impact of social media on young women. It's tragic. But you think about young men. Remember, I was talking about Oath Keepers, Proud Boys, and all that. They are driving young men into that cylinder silo as well. And I don't know if you've heard about, like, people, you know, young men, very sexual. There's pornography, obviously. And the pornography, I think, damages the way young men come to sex. But they also can be played on because of video games and the like. A lot of the same kind of lessons and incentives that are built into video games then get built into sexual content meant to attract young men. And the so-called incel or involuntarily celibate movement, anger at women, objectification of women, and a sense that, oh, guess what? These racial minorities and these women are not on our side. They're not about helping me to rise up in the world. They're trying to keep me as a white man or even a black man down. This is unbelievable. But this is the kind of moment that we live in. So when we think about social media, I'd ask all of you in the audience today to give a second look to the inauguration and think, why is Jeff Bezos, Elon Musk, I can go on, why are all these media titans seated right behind the incoming president? And why does he want them there? Well, money is an obvious answer, but a bigger answer would be, I don't think they want regulation of social media content. We regulate through the FCC, we regulate broadcast media, but you know, social media, unlimited. And you'll have some people say, anybody who wants to regulate it is trying to censor you or limit conservative or disparate thoughts. I think they're trying to say so much of that content is harmful.
Well, okay, we gotta have you back. I appreciate it. We're about to begin the audience Q&A for our live stream and our radio audience. I'm William Tarter Jr. I'm the president of the NAACP Cleveland branch and moderator for today's conversation. Today we're joined by Juan Williams, political analyst at Fox News and author of his latest book, New Prize for These Eyes, The Rise of America's Second Civil Rights Movement. We welcome questions from everyone, City Club members, guests, students, as well as those joining via our live stream at cityclub.org or our live radio broadcasts at 89.7 IdeaStream Public Media. If you'd like to text a question to Juan, please text it to 330-541-5794. That's 330-541-5794, and the City Club staff will work it into the program. May we have the first question, please?
We're going to begin with a text question to give people a chance to come on over toward the mic if you'd like. Mr. Williams, why do you think the popular news media has swung so far to the left and others so far to the right? And do you see any balance coming back?
Wow, so to me, a lot of this has to do with what gets clicks, what gets ratings, what gets eyeballs. And in the current media environment, being a provocateur, saying alarmist statements really helps to captivate or hold an audience. It used to be when I was coming up as a journalist, and again, I'm an old man, I know it, the idea was, can you back up what you say? Can I trust you and trust your institution in terms of delivering news content to me? So again, when I'm coming up, I'm looking at Walter Cronkite. You may not, there are people in this audience who go, who's that? But let me tell you, he was a famous news broadcaster for CBS. I'm looking at him and I'm thinking, wow, that guy's good and I trust him and I trust that CBS label and everything. That's news delivery. Today, Walter Cronkite couldn't make it in the current media environment. People say, that guy's a bore. I don't know what he supports or doesn't. Is he left? Is he right? Some people suggest he's opposed to the Vietnam War. Maybe he's a secret leftist. But the whole idea of trusting the media institution has been purposely derided and damaged to the point now that we are invested in personalities for delivery of news. So when you turn on prime time, I want you to keep in mind, you may not be getting news. You may be getting what's called infotainment. It might just be outright entertainment of people saying the most outrageous, crazy things that make you say, you know, Will, could you believe what that guy said? But it's intended to drive you to come back, to keep the ratings up, to keep the clicks coming, to keep the eyeballs fixed. And this is a different agenda for modern American media. So you ask me, why is it gone so far left, so far right? I think the answer is that the marketplace has been perverted. For my money, I said perverted, maybe distorted is a little less, but I think you get the idea. I think you have to, as the consumer, and I think here for the Cleveland Club audience, I would hope that you as consumers are, again, aware in the midst of a second civil rights movement, what you're getting online, what you're getting when you're tuning in to this very much polarized American media.
Can I also just give a shout out to IdeaStream Public Media for hosting the conversation today and underscoring the importance of the Senior Stream. So thank you.
IdeaStream Media you can trust, right? I want to thank you for being here. I want to thank you for Eyes on the Prize. I taught 40 years in Cleveland, and that literally became my second textbook. So I want to
thank you.
Yes, thank you for that. But my question, you know, the goal of, I'm going to say it, the white supremacists, is basically to divide us, divide everybody, especially children, to pit children against each other. So what would you say to white parents to try to keep their children from being afraid of black children and other children who don't look like them?
Well, this is a really important conversation. And you know, stay with me for a second, because I think it's about more than children. I think it's about you and me, and I think it's about more than white people. I think it's about black people, you and me. You know, I mean, the reality is, even as we're talking about, you know, dealing with injustices perpetrated by police violence against young black people who are so often viewed as looking threatening. You know, the Trayvon Martin argument about the hoodie and the music and, you know, the bop or whatever, the pants hanging down. The reality is, in my neighborhood in Washington, D.C., which is still mostly black, although it's being gentrified, I know that I am more likely to be killed by a young black man than I am by the white cop. And I say that as a black man. So when I see a young black person, especially a teenage black boy, on the street late at night, I understand fear. Now, I also understand injustice and stereotyping, and I understand it could be my son who's walking down the street. So I understand that. Now, how about if you are a white person and you see that younger black person and you start to caricature them as immediately a threat rather than another human being, somebody's child, someone's loved one, someone with a great deal of creativity and humanity in them. You instead, I think, just lock in on the racial angle and you don't see their humanity. To me, this is a loss. But it's a loss that I, as a black man, also deals with. As I said, it could be my son. So when you ask the question, the reason I asked you today is, I just think we have to be very forthright in these conversations about how we view our young people and encouraging them, as we encourage ourselves, to let their humanity be seen, to insist in being treated in a forthright manner as a fully human person, not simply the stereotype that exists in some white mind or in the minds of the police or adults who say, I don't understand these young people. By the way, you know, I risk going way off line here, but I mean, I think a lot of the hip hop music stuff, I think, encourages young black people to take on identities of, you know, that deal with being criminal or, you know, talk about women in the most offensive of ways. But again, that's part of our media and culture today.
Thank
you. You touched upon immigration when you were talking. Could you talk about that a little more for a moment, how it figures into the new civil rights movement?
Oh, immigration? Yes. Well, boy, it's hard not to talk about it at the moment. You can see people being deported and, you know, gathered up, and it's part of what's going on. But guess what? I think you, again, go back to Trump. Remember, he was deriding Mexican immigrants as thieves and rapists, I believe, is that, and you come forward and not so far, you know, Springfield, right? He has them eating your white people's pets, right? So what you see is a lot of the demonization of immigrants is used, I think, quite purposely for political ends, and the political end is his gain. So again, we were just talking about young black people being stereotyped unfairly. Again, not only by white people, but by black people, you know, that to me is just wrong. But there's also the reality that in so many big cities, we've seen a rush of immigrants into the country. And we see people living on the streets and people having to make accommodations in terms of city government, social safety net to help these immigrants as they're here, lacking kind of family and social connections. So the same point that I want to make in answer to the first question about young black men, I want to make an answer to you about immigrants, which is that there are legitimate and real concerns that we have to deal with about the number of immigrants now in the country, many of them illegally, and how we as a society are dealing to accommodate people like that so that they are not a threat. But to say I want to have that conversation is a long way from saying, oh, I think a lot of people might be scared. A lot of people might be angry. So I'll play on that. I will play on that to further divide us as Americans, to turn us into angry, screaming people who are unable to have a reasonable conversation about immigration reform and about how our communities are able to welcome people who are oftentimes needed as workers and as consumers to keep our economy booming. Instead, we're just angry and divided. We are being suckered in this game. And it's time to wake up and see that we're in the midst of this second civil rights movement.
Thank you for coming to Cleveland, Juan. Actually, we met in 2007 when I was a faculty member at Bowling Green State University. It was right around the time that you were here at the City Club, too. We brought you there to speak, and it's good to see you again.
Thank you.
A couple of questions. You talk about the second civil rights movement, and what I've been thinking about here lately, especially the past couple of weeks, is about issues pertaining to McCarthyism, but we'll talk about that at the book signing.
Okay.
At the book signing. My question for you is this: as a tenured faculty member here, in the Cleveland area, my colleagues and I recently have been talking about issues pertaining to what's happening. I'm bringing it closer to home now, to the state of Ohio. Issues that are happening at the state level in terms of SB 1, Senate Bill 1, which was titled something else before, and it didn't pass. And that was the removal from the curriculum of anything pertaining to diversity, equity, inclusion. So for example, I teach and developed a course in African American Studies, Intro to African American Studies. According to this particular state senator, who I won't mention his name either, you can't teach that. We don't want those types of courses taught within the curriculum K through 12 and obviously post-secondary in higher ed. So my colleagues and I are now asking these questions. What is it that's safe for us as tenured faculty members? What's safe for us to teach? Because we're concerned.
Well, you should be concerned. So again, you know, you could take your experience you're at Bowling Green?
No, I teach at Lake Erie College.
Oh, Lake Erie.
Yes.
And you could say, you know, this is what I'm going through and this bill, and you can just isolate and say, this frustrates me, and you not have the broader look at the panorama of America at this moment and say, you know, there's something going on. That's why I wrote New Prize for These Eyes, The Rise of the Second Movement, because I want you to see this when you not only have your experience here in Ohio, but when you hear that last week the Air Force said, we're no longer going to have mention of the Tuskegee Airmen or white women who were testing jets while the men went off to fight World War II. You say, my God, these are patriotic Americans who were sacrificing for the country in the midst of war, and you're saying you can't teach about them? It was so wild that conservatives appealed to the Defense Department to have the Air Force change its policy and put the Tuskegee Airmen and the women back into the curriculum. But you this is why I say this is such an important issue. I hear from people who say, you know, a lot of this talk about people like Rosa Parks, about slavery, about lynching, it just makes white kids feel bad. Like you're guilty, you know, by association, you're white, so you must be in trouble because you're on the wrong side of this story. And to my mind, what you're saying is you want to bleach or somehow sanitize America's story. You don't want to talk about Japanese being interned during World War II. Oh, it might make you feel bad. Well, there's something to feel bad about. And it's important as we go forward in trying to shape the America of this 21st century and beyond, that people say, oh no, we have that now in our pocket, in our minds, as wealth, as a positive. We know it, and we can use that to build a better America. It's not about making people feel bad, it's about making people informed citizens of this great land.
As a young person in America in the midst of a second civil rights movement, what do you think? Do you have a vision or advice for us to put an end to division between each other and group together to actually see a change happen?
Sure. So, you know, that's a great question. You know, how do we, in fact, counter the constant efforts to divide us? And I think part of this has to do with building coalitions. So it's really hard to not just focus on your concerns and your needs in any moment, at any age. It's so easy. I mean, this is your life, and you know, this is what you're up to. One of my big criticisms in this book of Black Lives Matter is that they didn't build coalitions, political coalitions, with, let's say, people who were concerned about abortion rights, which is a powerful political issue in the country. And it was right there as a way to reach out and say, you know what, we see your issue, we hope you see our issue. Or how about people involved with immigrant rights? We heard an earlier question. Why is it that Black Lives Matter didn't make a bigger effort to say, especially, by the way, to immigrants coming from Africa, the Caribbean, from Latin America, people of color, to say, the attacks on you are really a version of the attacks on us. And we can work together on your issue and you on our issue to help move forward. The bottom line for me here is that if you care about unity, we've got to win elections. You can't just complain about, oh gosh, you know, politicians are all self-centered and they all want you to make financial contributions. I don't like these politicians. I think the establishment is all about themselves and not about people like me. I think you got to start saying, you know what? To create change, positive change, we have to win elections. And in order to win elections, we've got to talk to people who are not like us. In fact, people who right now may be part of Make America Great Again, but who believe in justice and who want the best for themselves, their families, their communities, and say that racial peace and racial progress is essential for America to maintain and to grow and to be a prosperous place. It's essential for the well-being of you and your family. So we have to build coalitions by talking to people, sharing experiences, and being open. And I know that's hard. It's hard for me with my wife, but it's possible.
Thank you so much to Juan Williams and William Tarter Jr. joining us today at the City Club of Cleveland. Forums like this one are made possible thanks to generous support from individuals like you. You can learn more about how to become a guardian of free speech and contributor at thecityclub.org. Today's forum is the Stephen A. Minter Endowed Forum. Mr. Minter, who I'm proud to say was my dad, spent his life in service to others. He was the first African American to lead the Cleveland Foundation, the Cuyahoga County Welfare Department, the Massachusetts Public Welfare Commission, and he was the founding undersecretary of the U.S. Department of Education. He was also a proud City Club member and believed deeply in the City Club's mission and significance to our community. Thank you to the banks who endowed this forum in my father's name upon his retirement from the Cleveland Foundation. The City Club would like to welcome the students today joining us from the Cleveland School of the Arts, St. Ignatius High School, and Warrensville Heights High School. The City Club would also like to welcome guests hosted by Cuyahoga Community College, Aegeestrian Public Media, Friends of Mark Ross, and the Northeast Ohio Regional Sewer District. Thank you all for being here. Up next at the City Club, on Friday, February 7th, we will mark 10 years of Cleveland's consent decree. Joining us is Dorothy Todd, Chief of the Cleveland Division of Police, and Dr. Lee Anderson, Executive Director of the City of Cleveland's Police Accountability Team. And just announced, on Tuesday, February 11th, we will be joined by local leadership to discuss how the recent executive orders on immigration and refugee resettlement have impacted businesses, organizations, and Northeast Ohio communities. You can get tickets and learn more about these forums at cityclub.org. And that brings us to the end of today's forum. Thank you once again to Mr. Williams and Mr. Tarter. I'm Robin Minter-Smyers, and this forum is now adjourned.
Yeah, I was going to say, it's nice spending the morning with you.